All right. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Bethany Bear, and I will be the host for today's panel. To introduce a little bit about myself, I am an anti-racism ambassador for Experiences Canada, and I'm Canadian with Jamaican heritage that has a passion for civil rights. I host my own conversations where I talk to all kinds of people about topics such as this, and from teaching and creating programs for ages 3 to 16, I have also been able to work with all different kinds of youth. One of my biggest interests is researching the African diaspora and their origins, especially the Caribbean, and I hope to make an impact one day. Now, onto this panel. We are so excited to kick off our Experiences Canada Black Lives Matter and Anti-Racism online conversation series. In the wake of the pandemic, earlier this summer, Experiences Canada offered the first series of online conversation on reconciliation. After the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, youth inspired them to focus their second series on anti-racism. This series is being presented with the generous support of RBC Foundation. We are very grateful for the support and opportunity to encourage meaningful dialogue among youth across Canada. The first webinar in the series will be discussing the inspiration, Black Lives Matter and its impacts in Canada. An important item to address is that Black Lives Matter is both a movement and an organization. Chapters and countries as a whole contribute to the movement through participating in discussions, leading rallies, and creating resources based on past engagements. But today, we will be hearing from individuals whose work are not affiliated with the Black Lives Matter organization. They come to us to share their own experiences from how the movement has impacted their lives and workplaces. And for that, we are very grateful. Before we begin, I will briefly go over some Zoom features. Please mute and turn off your video for the presentation. We will be recording this session and it will be available on our website. If you have a question, feel free to type into the chat. Our anti-racism ambassadors will be collecting them throughout this discussion, so I can ask a few afterwards. If you experience technical difficulties, please raise your hand or message Lizzie. All right, so now on to our speakers. First, we have Aaliyah Paris. She is a queer Afro-Nofan Scotian and Congolese youth working in the fields of anti-racist education and trauma-informed sexuality education. She has worked with Unbound as well as Knock Shop, two leading sex and sexuality brands known for their innovation and integrity. Working mainly in community, Aaliyah spends most of her time organizing with the Abolish Police Kia Putkuk, assisting in the planning of actions and events. She's an ambassador for Empathy is Boring, a nonprofit organization based throughout Canada, and an anti-racism ambassador for Experiences Canada. Also has been working on planning an all Black Lives Matter street mural since June of 2020, having been featured in CTV as well as the Chronicle Herald for said work. She lives by the word, impact outweighs intent, and encourages others to figure out what that means for them. Next, we have Kwaku Agiamong. He's an artist, community organizer, and a Black student activist fighting for free and accessible education. He has been advocating for equitable education and holding university institutions accountable in the fight against anti-Black racism through his time as Vice President of Education at the Ryerson Students Union. He uses art through digital media, narrative storytelling, and events to foster community spaces that continue to bridge knowledge gaps of key issues impacting our Black youth today. He currently works at the Students' Commission of Canada, co-leading the Nobody's Born a Racist 2.0 project, which aims to bring youth across the country to address structural racism in Canada. And finally, we have Anna K. Russell. She is the Manager of Public Affairs at Woodgreen Community Services and the co-founder of the Canadian Black Policy Network, a policy-driven forum which seeks to provide unique opportunities to collaborate, innovate, and find sustainable solutions for policy issues affecting Black communities in Canada. She brings with her diverse expertise in public policy, governance, and sustainability. As alumni of the University of Toronto's Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and London College at York University, having worked in various roles in the research, public, and nonprofit sectors. Beyond managing the network, Anna K spends much of her time volunteering as Director of Strategy and Governance for Leading Change Canada and a member of Civic Action Reaction Task Force for Toronto's COVID-19 Economic Recovery Strategy. So once again, welcome. Thank you all for coming. And now let's go on to our questions. So the first question is, what is your take on the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement from the US to a global discussion? Whoever would like to go first. So yeah.
Yes, okay. I would say there's definitely been a large shift. We have had Black Lives Matter chapters in Canada for a while as well, the same as they have in the States. However, I've found that our movements, both connected to the organization and separate from the organization, have gotten larger. We stopped Pride in Toronto. Not sure what year that was because I'm in Jabuktuk right now, but that was a thing. We did it. There was an outroar. After that, it kind of slowed down and then it started to ramp back up, especially with everything going on in Flint and through the States. And we started to take the streets more here, which is great. With that as well, however, we've had, the racists and more ignorant people have been coming out of hiding. Like it's always been there. It's not new. It's, been festering and it has had time to ingrain itself in our medical system and every aspect of our life, essentially. Now these people are just more comfortable and you can't just blame it on Trump alone or Justin Trudeau doing blackface alone, right? Because these people have these ideals already. But definitely having these people in positions of power has comforted people who hold the same ideas. So now they feel just as comfortable going out, On the flip side of that, now I guess we do have people having conversations with their families, friends, just straight up refusing to put a racist product on the shelf or just not, going to a certain class if the teacher's going to be reading text that contains the N-word, because I know that's something that's going on in Ottawa right now, right? So things are changing, and I hope they do continue to change. However, I know that since June, the interest and support that white Americans have for the Black Lives Matter movement has decreased about 45%. And we don't track race data in Canada, so I'm not sure where we lie there, but we definitely have to keep it moving.
I agree. Kwaku, what do you think?
Yeah, I was just feeling like what Aaliyah was saying. I was just like, facts, facts, facts. This is definitely the way I've been feeling this year. And like my first as a young person, like interaction with Black Lives Matter was the situation that happened in Ferguson with Mike Brown. Having all of that play out and social media being a real thing and having access to all of these videos, even though at that time I didn't really notice, I didn't really understand the impact that seeing all of these videos of unarmed Black men and women, unarmed Black folks in general being murdered at the hands of police, how that would have an impact on mental health. But seeing that play out in the States and seeing a lot of the organizations happening in Canada was key because I was like, okay, it's about time. What's happening in the States happens in Canada. There was some sort of disconnect in which I was hearing a lot of the narrative around it's in the States, it doesn't happen in Canada. Why do we have a Black Lives Matter Toronto? Why are we pushing this narrative? It's only police brutality is only an issue in the States. But as children of the African diaspora, we understand how policing dates way back into, I was just having a conversation with my father around policing even in Africa, when we're talking about NSARS being relevant thing, policing originating in Africa was meant for when colonialism happened and policing people who were being transported for slavery, and even in the States, policing starting from policing escaped slaves, and even in Canada, the parallels with Indigenous peoples and seeing how the RCMP plays a role in policing oppressed communities. And so seeing this in the global context and this year being a big deal with the resurgence of a lot of the stuff we've been seeing. It's been a hard year, COVID, seeing all of these videos, seeing the action that took place at Ryerson, seeing the unfortunate event with Regis Korchinski Paquette, just brought a community of Black people together to say, hey, it's great that a lot of white people are starting to wake up again, that we've been doing this work for years, our whole life. It's great that we're having this popularity. How can we come together as a community to mobilize, take action? Because at the end of the day, Aaliyah said it's dropped 45%. We can't be relying on solidarity for too long. We have to mobilize and create work that's going to be sustainable.
Yeah. Anna Kay, what do you think?
First of all, thank you so much, again, Experiences Canada, for having me. I just want to quickly acknowledge that I'm calling from Toronto to Toronto, or the traditional lands of the Mississauga, the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. I find this question to be really interesting in terms of the word evolution and, how this Black Lives Matter movement has evolved from the US. I think, touching on what Kwaku just said, systemic racism and a history of slavery has also very much been present in Canada for, centuries. And I, similar to you, Bethany, I'm Jamaican born migrant to Canada like almost 20 years ago. And I came when I was really young. But even though I grew up in the education system here in Canada, I wasn't exposed to Canada's role in the oppression of Black communities until maybe 4 years ago, in university. And there's a lot that I've learned about the history of Canada, Canada's involvement in slavery. Slavery began in Canada around the 1600s. We annually celebrate Emancipation Day on August 1st, which is the day in which all of the British colonies celebrate the legal end of slavery. There were systemic barriers placed to oppress Black communities in Canada, including a ban or a potential ban on African diasporic migration. So preventing folks from African countries or African descent countries from migrating to Canada. There were also segregation in schools, in Africville, in Nova Scotia, here in Ontario, where I'm calling from. And when you look at today, there are still barriers being faced by members of Black communities across Canada. As Kwaku mentioned, police brutality. You have a lot of migrant farmers that are in the fields sourcing our strawberries and our spinach, who are Black and brown folks coming from majority Black countries like in the Caribbean. And and so when I think about the evolution of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think about how it's always been present here in Canada. It just wasn't as loud or as acknowledged by the broader Canadian population. And I think a lot of that actually has to do with what sort of Canadians are known for, which is our politeness. We're very much known for keeping things clean and being very kind to each other, which is great, and which is one thing that I love about being here in Canada. But I think it also prevents us from really acknowledging the tough situations that we deal with in this country, including with Indigenous communities as well as Black communities, and kind of having those tough conversations. But what I really appreciate about, as challenging and as traumatic as the series of events, including George Floyd's murder earlier in May, caused for a lot of our communities, I appreciate that it, allowed for a lot of Black folks to finally feel free to speak up and to call out what has already been there. So in terms of the evolution, I definitely acknowledge that what happened earlier this year definitely evolved the conversation from not just being within our own communities as Black folks, but with everybody else who's involved.
Yeah, I agree with that. Honestly, I love all your points. I really do. Now that like Black Lives Matter has become louder and people are listening and finally like listening to us and kind of answering to some of the stuff that we're trying to say, what has increased interest in Black Lives Matter as a topic of discussion been in your work? So whoever would like to go. Oh, okay, perfect. Leah.
I would say for me, it's created work, honestly. I guess I have the pleasure of working in community myself directly on the front lines and on the streets, planning actions and whatnot. So I've sort of been in the mix for a while. It's just now, unfortunately, you know, people keep getting murdered. There's increased cases of brutality. So there's just more and more work, right? It's like every other day almost, there's another graphic that needs to be made, or like another thing that needs to be planned, or a vigil. So like it's always something, and most of those things aren't seen by most people outside of the movement who don't work in organizing or who aren't personally impacted. They don't see all the work that goes into it. It's emotionally draining. Like most of us who are on the streets doing this stuff don't have a ton of money because the money is in the hands of usually the white people who have the power or are in politics, you know? So we're just, it's grassroots. We're doing all of this through community, you know, fundraising, like helping each other out. And that is definitely a positive, you know, that can come out of the additional work. But also I've found when working in places that aren't connected to activism, especially retail, some managers or customers definitely don't want to hear it. So there are a lot of Black people and marginalized people right now who are in those workplaces, and they can't talk about it. Like people get fired for speaking about it, right? And that's a hard thing to prove. So it's definitely a double-edged sword. We just have to support each other and believe each other. Like go with your friend to the labor board if you have to.
Kwaku?
Yeah, I think we thank you, Aaliyah, for that. Because I've definitely felt like the more work gets created, and I think we all can, as like Black people, can recall that time in like history class whenever the topic of race comes up, and then you get that look. It's like you have nothing to say, or like different things come up. In my previous role as vice president education at the Ryerson Students Union, we had more as like it was a dominant Black exec group, and so we were really focused on active work around advocating against special constables on Ryerson campus, holding the Ryerson University accountable to anti-Black racism and doing that work. The difference is, as Black organizers, as Black student organizers, there was already an understanding amongst ourselves that this is work that needed to be done. And so it wasn't something that we had to wake up to and be like, we need to make sure that we're doing this. The positive aspect of working for an organization like Students Commission, in which previous work has been done. And so in 1995, we started, in 1995, the organization led Nobody's Born a Racist, which is a project that brought together Black and Indigenous young people across the country to produce knowledge around combating structural racism in Canada and what that looks like in a national lens. And with the resurgence of all the conversation happening this year, we've launched Nobody's Born a Racist 2.0, which looks to actually innovate how we share knowledge and how we gather knowledge, but most importantly, amplify the work of different organizations that are doing anti-racism work. As we understand, in Canada, we have a lot of great organizations who are doing work locally, as needs to address racism is really prevalent from a local regional context. But how do we take that work and amplify it nationally to ensure that we're influencing systems across? So that's one of the big focuses that we've had come up with the increased interest of BLM. A big thing we're focused on is how do we do work internally to ensure that we're equipping staff who are racialized, non-racialized, equipping them with the necessary tools to combat racism within, and seeing how the role racialized, non-racialized staff play in influencing safer spaces within the work environment. So we're seeing a lot of organizations take action to structural racism, get rid of structural racism from within. And so seeing how we can support, but also looking at what does that work look like. It's not a simple fix-all approach in which we all just attend Zoom consultations with a external third party. It's how do we do work that makes your experience with anti-racist work meaningful? How do we make it immersive? And how do we actually move towards change as opposed to the casual checklist off boxes? Within the youth sector, that's what we can do to influence the youth sector, but we understand that there are other industries in engineering, corporate, finance, environment, like there are other industries that would need to do this work to ensure that we are taking collective action for collective impact at the end of the day, as everybody wants to move towards addressing structural racism.
Yeah, so in terms of how the Black Lives Matter movement has impacted the work that I've been doing. So as Bethany mentioned at the beginning, I am the co-founder of the Canadian Black Policy Network. And for those of you who might not be familiar, public policy is basically the kind of actions or courses of actions that the government decides to take in order to address a certain issue or series of issues or challenges. And I guess to give a little bit of background on how I found myself in this position. So when I was done my undergraduate studies in environmental studies and sustainability, I was introduced to public policy, and I had never, ever heard about public policy in my life before. I didn't know what it was. But what made me so curious about it was how much influence it has on how we function as an individual, as a community, et cetera, as a country. And, you know, it kind of made me realize, well, if I want to help influence change, public policy might be a great way to do that. And I also didn't want to become a lawyer because it involved too much reading, and I just don't like reading. Or I don't like reading that much, but reading is good for you. Anyways, so while I was doing my Master of Public Policy degree at the University of Toronto, I recognized just how homogenous my professors were, as in they were all white, how homogenous my studies were. We focused a lot on kind of generalizing public policy and how to apply it to different communities, even though Canada is such a diverse country. And I also realized how homogenous the public policy sector is. When you look at a lot of politicians, many of them are white. When you look at who a lot of ministers and deputy ministers and folks who are really at the decision-making levels in government are, a lot of them are white. And even though it may not be evident, your lived experience influences your decision-making in a way where if we're applying public policy to a diverse community or a community you don't have lived experience in, you might end up making assumptions about how that policy will be impacted in that community that might be different from how it should be impacting that community. And so while I was in my Master of Public Policy program at U of T, I decided to co-found the Toronto Black Policy Conference, which was first held last November with the City of Toronto's Confronting Anti-Black Racism Unit. And I had a link. I will post a link in the chat right now. I just posted a link to our website. What is actually really great, again, I hate using that language, great about the George Floyd incident, it's not great, but a positive outcome of it was that my organizing committee and I decided to actually launch the Canadian Black Policy Network in response to the Black Lives Matter resurgence that took place in June, because we recognized that public policy, as I said, plays so much influence in the decision-making. Police brutality, public policy influences that. Education and the amount of Black students who drop out of school or are put into detention or are put into lower level classes than they should be. Public policy influences that. The lack of race-based data in health equity, public policy influences that. So, you know, I really wanted to figure out how can we help spread the word of the influence of public policy to Canada's broader Black communities. And so we decided to launch this network in response to that. And we're going to be hosting our first official event for the network at the end of November next month. And we're really hoping to expand and hopefully in, a couple of years, 5 years down the line, have actually chapters of public policy, Black public policy networks across the country. So that's definitely how this resurgence has influenced my work for sure.
Thank you. Thank you for your answers. Honestly, I love how you guys are really making a change, and really, I really appreciate that. And I love that. So our last question is, how do you feel Canadians have changed since the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement?
Okay, I feel like I'm gonna go back and reference something I said earlier in the sense that not much has literally changed. They're just, ignorant people are more bold. And also on the other side of things, Black folks were tired. I mean, not that we weren't tired before, but like it's ramping up, especially with the new technology we have now, which makes harassment and any other type of racist actions way easier to commit or throw upon a person. I would hope that things are slowly starting to change a bit more in terms of government and whatnot, as far as like maybe there's a few people in there who are like thinking in their head that, the right idea, they have the right idea, they're just with the wrong people. So I feel like the hope is that some of these people will maybe leave and just, because we can't really work with broken systems that were literally invented to oppress us as people. We have to have enough people, a collective of folks, from like all over, straight from the diaspora, Nova Scotia, Toronto, wherever. Like we need to have people together to create new systems so that we can just take the other systems and, just throw them in the trash, so to speak.
100%. And it's like with Black Lives Matter, the movement, Canadians are starting to listen more. They're starting to ask more questions. And this is like to commend the organizations, all the corporations who have taken at least one step. I know we need to push for more to address this issue, and all the equity, diversity, and inclusion offices that are open up. That's really important. Keeping that going to ensure that some movement is being made. Of course, there are more active actions that can be taken, but giving credit where it's due to keep moving forward, and to credit the work of Anna Kay and like Black policy and public policy is really important, because now we need to get the government to take action. We need the government to actually start making movements as opposed to just performative advocacy, and sort of equipping them with the right knowledge to really better serve Black communities. Because at this point, when we hear people talk about abolishing or dismantling law enforcement, it's a matter of, back to what Aaliyah said, it's systems that were built on oppression and around, okay, we love the idea of law enforcement, it makes us feel safe, but when law enforcement is built upon systemic racism, it's not here to make us feel safe, it's not here to protect and serve, it's racist, point blank. And so if we want some sort of system, and this is an example of one branch of systemic racism, not even to say that represents all, but if we want some form of law enforcement that people want, then it's like, let's as a society come together and input proper policy and proper reform to ensure that those who are suffering from mental health aren't murdered at the hands of police in crisis situations, demilitarizing police systems and police forces, ensuring unarmed people aren't dying at the hands of police. And so these are many examples of how we need to hold the government accountable now, because the people are listening, people are understanding, people are tweeting, people are sharing videos, organizations are hiring Black, organizations are pushing out these initiatives. Now let's connect the dot and ensure that the government is held accountable to really amplifying a lot of the work being done.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, Kwaku. And something that I had mentioned earlier about how I feel Canadians have changed is that I think it's a lot easier to call it out now, to call things out now. I feel like there are so many organizations that now have an anti-racism committee, or, now have a programming, or they brought in consultants who could kind of review with all their staff, what it is to be racist or anti-Black, and how can you avoid those situations in the workplace, etc. A lot of corporations, as you said, Kwaku, that came out saying, like, we don't stand for this, etc. But that's only so much. There's still so much more to be done. And, from my own personal experiences, I've definitely found it challenging in the workplace to speak up when I felt uncomfortable about things, whether it be microaggressions, somebody trying to touch my hair or trying to say something definitely offensive, but also even in the work that I do, and me having my own lived experience and knowing that the way of the work could be negatively impacted towards Black communities. I've in the past felt unsafe to speak up about something as a Black person, but also being the only one in the room. In terms of the role of government, I've seen the government, as well as a lot of other, foundations and corporations, coming out and putting a lot of money towards Black-led and focused organizations, which I think is fantastic. A lot of donations increased as well for Black-led and focused organizations in the summer. But I think that needs to continue for sure. But I think in addition to funding, I think capacity building is really key for Black community members. That's kind of the work that I'm doing with the Canadian Black Policy Network. We're really trying to not only push for policy change within the government, but we're trying to build capacity and knowledge mobilization, or like help other Black folks understand what public policy is and how it influences and impacts their daily lives, so that they know what to do when they encounter a situation of public policy, or they know how to get engaged. At our conference we had in November, we invited a group of high school students to attend the conference just to learn more about public policy, and to be surrounded by an entire room of Black policy professionals. It was actually like really amazing. And I had some kids come up to me and say like, oh, I want to learn more about public policy. How can I get involved? I've heard about the program you went to, like, how can I study more about it? All of that. And that's exactly what we want to see. As much money that can be thrown at Black communities, there also needs to be that capacity building within, so that we're equipped to know how best to use the resources that we have access to help, further build up our communities and further enhance the impact that we're trying to make. So yeah, there's definitely been a change for the positive, but I think there's a lot further that we can go.
All right, so now we have some questions from the audience. And our first one is from Wendy. She asked, how can we support Black men in particular with so much access or visibility of execution of Black men online, taking into account mental health and the ways men are taught not to talk about their feelings? Kwaku, what do you think?
Can you sort of clarify the question for me? Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah, no problem. So she asked, how can we support Black men in particular? I guess because a lot of times as Black men, we see getting harassed or sadly executed or beaten by police force, things like that. And also just how we can take into account mental health, because sometimes lots of Black men are taught not to talk about their feelings. So.
Yeah, it's definitely hard. It's not the easiest thing to cope with. I felt like personally, like my mental health took a hit. I mean, I don't know what the distraction was like pre-COVID when all of this was happening, that I was able to just be like retweet and quote tweets, in which in June it was like a slump of like, yo, people almost thought I was like, and I'm not even trying to make this a light conversation, people thought I was conservative because I wasn't really sharing mad like content, I was like, I'm drained, man. This is a lot. I'm at home and this is scared of COVID, scared of police. It's a big deal. And I think it just starts with community, fostering more spaces for community with Black men. Black men sort of, and this is just my personal experience, is probably different for other Black men or not homogenous, but it's like not really always looking for spaces to get along, looking for spaces to be vulnerable, looking for spaces to be emotional. And so having that space to be heard, fostering more space for Black men to be heard, to vent, to be angry. And then we could build upon what does it look like for mental health supports? How do we usher Black men into the overall conversation of all Black Lives Matter? And what does it look like for queer and trans folk? What does it look like for all Black bodies? And having that solidarity amongst all Black people at once is really important. And sort of starting from family first, everybody being involved. And that's where I was like, I don't have the answer for that, but I know what's really helped me was there was like a Black men's Black male identified group through Zoom every Saturday to discuss everything, to unwind, vent, and everything that really helps. And I know it's been helping a lot of Black men in this situation, but starting with family first is key.
All right, so we have another question from Catherine, and this is directly to Aaliyah. So she asked, when you say there are more cases that are rising, do you mean since June? Does that tie back to when you said people are feeling emboldened with the people in power that we have?
Can you slightly rephrase?
No problem. So she said, so when you said that cases are arising, so I guess, and she asked, do you mean since June? She asked if does that tie back to when you said people are feeling emboldened with people in power that we have?
Okay, so since June, public interest from white Americans, because in Canada we don't track race data, so interest from that group of people to the Black Lives Matter movement has decreased since June. That's not to say that there's been a rise in incidences since June, because we really don't have a solid way of tracking all of those, but definitely more is being recorded, more is being shared now, more is being broadcasted. So if as an individual you're seeing more of it now, you find that would be why, more people are paying attention to it. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. We also have a question from a grade 8 student, and they asked, how has COVID-19 affected the Black Lives Matter movement? And Kay, what do you think?
Well, I definitely think it's provided another example of how systemic oppression is more heavily felt in Black communities. And I say this not only for the US, but also for Canada. When you look at the healthcare system and which communities have been hardest hit, at least in Ontario, that's data that I've really taken a look at. A lot of the communities are made up of people of color, and a lot of the communities of color are Black communities. And when you think about who gets to stay at home during COVID versus who is an essential worker and has to go out on the front lines, a lot of times you'll find immigrant individuals, people of color, women who are in those essential services and who are closer to the virus, and who may also, due to a lot of other systemic barriers, have preconditions that make them even more susceptible to the virus and can catch the virus more easily. And so I would say that that's definitely one way that I see how COVID-19 has impacted the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's just provided another very stark example, very obvious example of just how disenfranchised, or not disenfranchised, sorry, but how oppressed and disadvantaged a lot of communities of color and Black communities are in respect to health.
Yeah, I agree. I think the lockdown really got people to do more research and really learn about what's going on. So yeah, definitely agree. We have a question from Nicole. I really like this question. She says, to all the panelists, as a first generation African Canadian, shout out to Ghana, what is your take on the diaspora's wars? Do you believe that the disconnection between Africans, Caribbeans, etc., prevents the unifying of the Black community? How has this, in your opinion, impacted the Black Lives Matter movement?
That is, that's a tricky conversation to have. I'm born and raised in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Chibukchuk. I'm Afro-Nova Scotian and Congolese. But just growing up here, I didn't really have the chance to be around Congolese culture at all, really. There is not a huge community in Halifax. So I have my own disconnect there, which is interesting, both like paying attention to what's going on in Congo and Africa as a whole, and then also like what's happening in Canada. We definitely need to work harder, like as Black people, to do our best to try to find a middle ground on some things. Obviously, we're not like an exact carbon copy of one another. We have differing opinions. Some of us are conservatives, unfortunately, so we just really need to do our best to just talk. Yeah.
If I can jump in as well. So I actually was a part of a panel back in the summer that was organized by a friend of mine. I'm trying to look up the name right now. The Digital Diaspora. So my friend co-founded this or founded this organization, and her goal is actually to work towards linking the different diasporas across the world. And she was great in organizing it because she's Ethiopian, but she was adopted by a Norwegian family, and then she came to Canada and did studies here. She currently lives in Belgium, and I'm not sure what her fiance's background is, but he is also African. And on that panel, we had somebody who was Black and German on the panel. We had somebody who was Black and like African American on the panel. As I mentioned, like I was on the panel as well, and I'm also double diasporaed. And, it was really interesting because even though we all had different experiences with the Black Lives Matter resurgence in June, we all had the commonalities in our experiences was actually really present. Like a lot of us felt the same when we saw George Floyd's murder broadcasted around the world. A lot of us shared the same sentiments of not watching the video or feeling very traumatized after watching it. A lot of us had similar feelings about not really knowing where we fit in, but also knowing that when you see another Black person, even if you're in a different country, you immediately feel a sense of connection, And even though I totally understand and agree that there are a lot of differences, and I think also a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge about each of our different experiences, I think if we do take the time to just sit down and share what those experiences are, you'll kind of realize just how similar the experiences are, surprisingly, as well as how connected we can feel from that. And I think that is not something that's impossible to achieve, but it's definitely not something that's happening as often as it should be. So the panel that my friend held back in the summer was amazing. And I think more conversations like that could really benefit sort of unifying us as a global community for sure.
I think there's also a problem when outsiders or non-Black people look at Black people to have PhDs in Black issues in regards to what does this mean? What does this mean? You don't know what this means? The whole movement doesn't make sense. Throw this out, right? And understanding that Black people of the diaspora have been abused, have been divided. If we look at public education systems, if we look at media, and it's tough, and it's trauma healing. Healing through trauma takes a long time, and I personally don't believe there's an inherited disconnect amongst the diaspora of like Black people across the world. And I think we're starting to see it now with the social media, with the media that we're seeing, with SARS, and seeing what's happening in Africa, and people starting to do more research. Last year, and it's interesting, the parallels in last year in 2019, in December, Ghana held the Year of Return, in which a lot of people from the States and from North America that are Black went back to Ghana to sort of do a return voyage, to sort of understand the country, understand West Africa, and bring closer to culture. And I think as we move forward, if COVID wasn't a big issue right now, I'm pretty sure that people would be flying to Africa to engage and participate in activism that's going on the ground right now. But it's tough. Combating the division, bridging more gaps is more important across Black communities.
Yeah. And now I have a question from an anonymous attendee. They asked, is there a way to share something? Wait, okay. I didn't use my computer. Something that I am doing in various initiatives on redefined wellness spaces for BIPOC women and or various identities that continues in the longer with handouts and shared circles. And there are other ways of culturally healing to show up fully in the work that one does that may be beneficial for people here. Okay, so they're going to share their program. I'm sure they can leave a link here. And say pay as you can, base no one will be turned away due to the lack of funds, but even $1 and going towards accountable wellness and accountable inclusion, research and policy, community spaces to be financially accessible. Yeah, so hopefully they can add in the link there. And then we also have a question from Kathleen's grade 8 class. A grade 8 student asked, what race data is tracked in the USA and why don't we track it in Canada?
I mean, I pay attention to American politics, but I don't pay attention to everything in detail like that. I assume, well, honestly, everything's so skewed, it's hard to tell. They track their police data at least a bit when it comes to street checks, arrests, stuff like that. But it's still relatively unreliable. I guess they also have the census. But when you look into that and also realize that in the US especially, not that this isn't an issue here because it still is, voter suppression and other things keep people away from participating in a census or any other thing that would document like who they are and what they've experienced.
Yeah, I would say I think the US tracks a lot more detailed data than Canada. Canada, through our census, there is information gathered on like what is the Black population in Toronto versus in Winnipeg, but in terms of like health-based data, I know that Ontario is about to begin collecting that information. And Toronto, the University of Toronto, they also have made a move to begin collecting race-based data for students, specifically to sort of gather that student experience. But I think the problem with race-based data collection in Canada is it's slowly starting to happen now, but it's taken so long that there's not that much work that can be done because the data isn't there. Whereas the US has been collecting that data for a while. And I think it's because their race challenges have just been way more prominent and outspoken in a lot of areas rather than in Canada. But I think it's starting to pick up in Canada. It's just taken a really, really long time. So yeah.
And there's a need to it just starting collecting Canada. There's a need to hold those collecting the data to account, in which taking it serious, making sure it's a secure process. Because if we're just starting to take it now, looking at the time that's gonna take for it to have any meaningful story being told, it's something that, okay, when we take it now, making sure we're asking the right questions, making sure it's the right quantitative research in which it's secure, and that when time comes, we're able to paint a story and we're not meeting, oh, they stopped collecting the data at some point, what went wrong, and now we have to start again, right? And so we have to make sure it's serious.
Well, we ran out of time. Thank you for all the questions. Sorry we couldn't get to them. They'll be sent to the panelists and it will be shared on our website. So I'd like to thank you. Thanks to Anna Kay, Aaliyah, and Kwaku for joining us today. I am definitely leaving this conversation even more inspired and motivated to continue the conversation of how important Black Lives Matter is, not only as a movement, but also the truth. And I hope all those who are watching do as well. I would like to give a huge shout out to our sponsor, RBC Foundation. We are very grateful for their support in giving this wonderful opportunity to encourage meaningful dialogue on anti-racism among Canadian youth. Please fill out the post-event survey. The link is found here in the chat, and share what you found useful so more opportunities like this can be created. For the youth listening in today, check out our online conversations Facebook group and the Experiences Canada website for some additional resources and activities. And links for both will be available in the chat. The weekly challenge and the activity this week for youth is all around who are the change makers behind the Black Lives Matter movements in Canada. Youth will explore the Canadian Black Lives Matter website and then share their thoughts on what they found. Make sure to share your thoughts on social media using the hashtag Experiences Canada, hashtag anti-racism, and hashtag anti-racism conversation. And with that, thank you for joining us today. Make sure to keep an eye on our social media for more information on Black Lives Matter and its impact in Canada. And don't forget to join us for our next week for our Introduction to Anti-Racism webinar. So once again, thank you everyone. Take care, stay safe.